Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I'd like to continue talking about my current project of coding the combat system for a viewer's game. As you can see, I've started a combat here, and if we scroll down, we can see that there is a slight change in the display. There's not really a change in any of the gameplay. There's no extra options or options that have been removed or changed. It's just that these buttons, which were previously on sort of printed just one after the other on a single line, are now kind of printed over several lines. I think I mentioned this briefly in the previous video as a side point, but I did notice that doing it the way that I was doing it, which was printing them just one after the other, sometimes you would have enough buttons that you would start a second line of buttons. And what would happen then is that the button on this line and then the button on the next line would sort of overlap. They wouldn't be sort of properly spaced for some reason. And I found this on two different computers, so I think it's a problem that would happen on most displays. Although of course I'm not sure because I've only seen those two, but even if it is only those two, it was still worth dealing with. So I decided to put some characters in to sort of to break it up rather than have everything on the one line. And you might think, well, that would be quite simple, James. You just put line breaks every few buttons. It was surprisingly complicated, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I didn't want to have commands that are sort of a similar type on two different lines. I thought that would be sort of counterintuitive. So, for example, I have, in this particular case, we have the option to retreat. We don't have the option to advance because the enemy's right in front of us, but usually you would have advance and retreat. And it would seem counterintuitive to me to have those two on different lines. You'd probably want to sort of group those together because they're similar sorts of commands to do with moving the player character. Similarly, we have shoot and pistol whip, which are different ways of attacking with, in this case, a pistol. And again, it would seem counterintuitive to me to have those on different lines. You'd probably want to group those two together. And so that was my first sort of restriction. I wanted to have similar types of command on the same line because I thought having them on two different lines would feel a bit, feel a bit counterintuitive, feel a bit messy or sort of badly laid out or something. The second problem is you don't always have the same commands. So if I had a different weapon, sometimes I would have only one attack. Usually I would have two, but certainly the names would be different. It wouldn't be shoot and pistol whip. It would be, two other things, throw and something else. And because it's different text, they're going to have different widths. So I can't say, oh well, I'll put a break after the weapons, and have that be the right place to put it for every possible arrangement, if that makes sense. I don't know how much width these commands are going to take. And similarly, most of the time you'd have advance and retreat. Sometimes, as in this case, you just have retreat. Sometimes you might have no buttons, etc. And so if I always have the break here, it's going to sometimes look a bit weird or be a bit uneven, because what we're trying to do, I guess, is get them as even as possible. So I guess there's two ways to deal with that, apart from just forgetting about it altogether. Let's assume we want to solve this problem. I could have had a complicated system where I work out the width of every single button, and then once the widths get to a certain point, do a break or have some algorithm to try and work out the sort of ideal, the layout that's going to have the least sort of overhang like this. But I thought that was too much for what is, after all, a pretty minor problem. It's a problem of layout. It's not really a problem that changes the gameplay at all. So I went with what is the second option, which is experiment and try and sort of test the game with different arrangements of what's in my hand and what I'm holding, etc., and try and find a sort of a least worst fit. So keep it simple at the cost of not having the widths be as even as perhaps I could have made them, and try and sort of come up with a layout that's, okay in most circumstances, sort of thing. And that's what I went with. I went with the second option. There was also a problem, which is that I thought just doing a single return would fix the problem, but actually no, it didn't. When I just did a return, the two buttons were still slightly overlapping, just as they were originally. It didn't change the problem at all. So let's get into the code, and I'll show you what I did. All of this code is in the passage player character, because that's the only place where you print all the different options that the player has, and it's the only place where you have this problem. There aren't any new variables required for this. Let's find the first line break. There it is, or set of line breaks. So this is what I did. I did a line break. That's what this less than BR greater than less than BR greater than is. It's that tells Twine it's a return character. And then I had another line break, but I wrapped it in this div /div, and I had this thing here which makes it smaller. It says style equals quote font dash size space 15% end quote. And that does exactly what you would expect from hearing that. It makes the font 15% of the normal size, the default size that it's already printing. And so that is that makes a tiny little gap, but that tiny little gap was enough to separate the two lines of buttons. But it didn't make it too big. I found I started by trying just let's have two line breaks without, and so it was like that. It was like that without this line, but that was that created way too big a gap. That looked funny in a different way. And after some experiment, so that fixed the problem of sort of separating them without making them be too far apart. And after some experimentation, I found sort of where the best place to put the line breaks were. So that's the first one. Excuse me, I keep squeaking a bit today. I don't know why. That's the first one, and that happens after the advance and retreat options and the attacking options. And then we have a second one after the buttons given order and companion inventory. But quite importantly, this line break is inside this if. This if z equals 1, if z equals 1, that means that you've found a companion that's alive. And because if you don't find a companion that's alive, there's no point having given order or companion inventory. They are both dependent on there being a companion to give an order to or look at their inventory, of course. I actually moved the companion inventory button next to given order. I had it down the bottom just because it was the one that I had added most recently, but I moved it up here to make the grouping a bit more logical. If this wasn't within this if, then sometimes you wouldn't print these two buttons, but you'd have a line break anyway, so you'd have this sort of blank, you'd have this blank line. And then finally, I have the last line break, which is here, and it too is within an if. It's within the if that governs whether you're going to print the swap hands button. So why there in particular? Why after that one? Well, the reason is because after swap hands, there's only two possible buttons that can print. There's stow main weapon and stow offhand weapon. And if you don't print swap hands, you're not going to have both of those buttons, because if you don't print swap hands, that's because either you don't have any weapons, in which case, of course, you're not going to have the option to stow main weapon or stow offhand weapon because you don't have a main weapon or offhand weapon, or you have a two-handed weapon. You can't swap two-handed weapons. The two-handed weapon always has to be in your main hand. And if you don't, if you have a two-handed weapon, well, then you're not going to have the option to stow offhand weapon. You're only going to have stow main weapon. And you can have stow main weapon and inventory on the same line. You can see by looking at the lengths of those. If this one was up here and this one wasn't here, that would still look fine. So therefore, if you don't print swap hands, or at least I determined that most of the if you don't print swap hands, not having the line break is probably the least worst option. If I had no swap hands, but I did have the line break, in other words, if the printing of the line break wasn't inside that if this was, say, down here and therefore always printed, well, you'd have this inventory just on the line by itself, and then stow main weapon on the line by itself, and that would probably look a bit weird given the width that you've got up here. You'd probably, looking at that, you'd probably think, well, it would look better if stow main weapon had been moved up there. And so that's essentially what I've done. So that's a very long-winded way of explaining it. I didn't sort of logically work it out in the way that I've described there. I actually sort of found it by trying a couple of different things, and this seems to be the best option. But basically, if you don't print the swap hands button, you don't print the line break either. And therefore this one and possibly the next one will be up here, and that looks okay. It looks a lot better than having inventory and stow main weapon on two lines, but then having inventory swap hands. Well, having inventory swap hands and stow main weapon on the same line would probably look okay, but having inventory swap hands, stow main weapon, and stow offhand weapon, that would definitely look a bit weird. You'd look at that, and compared to these widths, you'd probably want it broken up. So having the line break dependent on the swap hands button seems like it sort of gives the best results overall, if that makes sense. So there you go. Something that you probably, and of course most people who play this will probably just never look at that and never think about the way that it's laid out. But that is programming. You often spend an evening fiddling with this one thing to try and make it smooth and make it not noticeable. And of course, if you succeed in that, people aren't going to notice what you've done. They will only notice if you sort of fail and it looks weird and wrong. That's the nature of programming. It's probably the nature of layout in general. I think you often want layout to be intuitive and something that the user doesn't notice. And making it something intuitive and not noticeable is surprisingly complicated and time consuming. So that's what I've done with my day. And I will leave it there. In my next video, I'm probably going to keep looking at dealing with ordering the companions to change their weapons. We sort of started doing that in the previous video, and I kind of interrupted that to deal with this problem just because I noticed it and wanted to get it out of the way. So we'll probably next video, we'll probably be looking at how the player character can order their companion to choose a different weapon, and also dealing with the companions not being able to shoot if they've run out of ammunition, which is something that we've dealt with for the player character, but we haven't yet dealt with for companions. Luckily, that won't require any more buttons to be added here because I've sort of got it set up as good as I can get it now, and so adding another button would sort of, make me go back and do the work again. Luckily, that's all going to happen on other screens. But I will leave it there for now. I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.